Hello, Gordon. I'm honored to be here with you, speaking to you today. And before I start, I just want to say that I stand here before a community of people at Gordon who spend a lot of time thinking about how to create, implement, and help you through Gordon study abroad programs and various opportunities you have through Global Education Office. We think about a lot of details and how to get it all done, but really at the end we have certain bigger goals in mind. And maybe at the very far end of that is we want to help you get the sort of experience when you go abroad that will help you become people who can respond to life, not just go through life reactionary way, but respond. Now, one of the things that's so fun about going abroad and what I liked really about being abroad for like 14 years, studying in America, is that you get to try a life that wasn't supposed to be yours. You get to go to a place and try to be somebody else in that space. And sometimes you discover, I've always liked doing things this way, and it was really strange in my home, but here it's normal. I was meant to be here. So it can be really fun going to Croatia or Italy and discovering strange things like how much water there's in a toilet bowl, as well as that, you really always just liked walking places and not having to drive everywhere. So we hope, though, that when you go abroad and you experience these new and exciting things and you're free in a certain sense, that you also remember that who you are coming over there, and that you use that opportunity to grow, to get to know yourself, to get to know how you respond to things. So here's my talk for you related to all of that. Life is difficult. This is the first line of Scott Peck's psychology book that was one of first of its kind and very popular at the time, called The Road Less Traveled. And many of us who have read this book remember this line, life is difficult, which basically means that we have a difficult time accepting that. It is not a new idea, and my husband reminded me Scott Peck was actually quoting Aristotle, who lived a long, long time ago and said this. But we still have a difficult time facing this. A French Jewish philosopher, Simone Weil, put it even more poignantly when she says that the truth of life is suffering. How we relate our life to suffering, furthermore, she tells us, will determine our own lives and our lives with others. So today I will speak about that, about suffering and human responses to it, and how the way we approach suffering affects who we become as people. In the Balkan semester for the study of war and peace, we regularly visit Srebrenica Genocide Memorial in eastern Bosnia. And there we are faced with suffering caused by violence on a scale that puts in question just about everything about the way we live. In a similar way that the Holocaust put in question life in Europe after World War II and much of the world. So what happened in Srebrenica? In the summer of 1995, one army, after 4 years of fighting between two different armies, and keeping 50,000 refugees from the surrounding areas in this tiny little town without supplies, ended the siege by killing really entire families, sometimes 4 or 5 generations of men and boys in the span of a few days. It is really difficult to face this, and when we visit Srebrenica, we listen to mothers telling stories how their sons, as young as 12, were taken from their clutching arms, and they couldn't do anything. And we stand there, students and faculty, and ask, how and why do things like that happen? But they do, and they happen over and over again. To give you a little more context of where I'm speaking from, and Laura already gave you a little bit of that, and why Srebrenica is additionally personally challenging for me, I will tell you about my own experience during the war in the 90s in the Balkans. How many of you were born in the 1990s? Raise your hands. All right, okay. So it's not totally ancient history. And since I'm here, it's not totally remote place. And since Gordon has the Balkans program, it's kind of part of our community here as well. So what happened in Croatia and in Bosnia, and to me. So Srebrenica is on the furthest eastern front of the war in the Balkans. And I lived and was born in the westernmost point of the war. In my town, the war started, and then it spilled over through the rest of the Balkans and into Bosnia. And really, the events in Srebrenica ended the war. They were the reason that the international community got involved, and eventually the Dayton Accords were signed in Dayton, Ohio. So Srebrenica, when I go there, in a sense, it's like bookends to my story, Srebrenica and my town, Slunj. And like what Laura said, they're both really beautiful, lush towns with hills and rivers. So for me, the first taste of brutality of war I got when I was 11 and my family was returning from a vacation from the coast where we went every year, and we were stopped just before our town on the road by men armed with machine guns. Now, I had never seen a machine gun before, and yet alone had one pointed at me. The men took my parents out of the car, and my brother was sleeping in the car, and they had their guns at us, and they were going to take away my dad. And my mom was incredibly brave, and she said, no, I'm not going. If he goes, they wanted to let us go and take him. If he goes, we are all going with him. And that created kind of an unrest with the men, because this was the beginning of the war. They were not used to taking children yet. And one man kept saying, I don't feel comfortable taking children. But this could have gone a lot differently. They eventually let us go. The day after we passed through, another man was stopped in the same spot, and he was taken to a concentration camp and exchanged at the end of the war in 1995. After years of torture, he was pretty much unrecognizable to his family. So we made it back into the town, but now we had to contend with a different sort of life. This was no longer about ordinary life circumstances. This was about survival, because we were under siege. We, for 4 months, had no supplies. We had no electricity, no water. There was no food coming into town, no gas. Luckily, we had these rivers that gave us water, which is very essential to life, you learn. And all day long, we heard grenades falling around the town on surrounding villages, and getting, the ring was getting tighter and tighter over time, until eventually the bombings were really in the town. All along, we would hear bullet casings fall on our roof, because they would be shooting at each other with guns, but not yet grenades. And then one night, the grenades were so close that they were actually right next to our house. Our house was filled with smoke. There were all the flashes of light that happened. And the next day, my parents, through prayer, decided they're just going to go. They're going to go through the siege, and they're going to take us somewhere, because the end is here. And my dad felt really peaceful about it. He felt like God was saying, yeah, it's the right time. And so the idea was that we will go, and my dad will leave us somewhere safe, and he will come back. But as soon as we got through the siege, we realized that there's no going back. And how do we pack for this journey that there was no going back on? I mean, my parents told me, go to your room and take a toy. And then my mom said, take your backpack that's been standing in the foyer, the small backpack with essential supplies if you had to just run out of the house. And that's pretty much what we took, because again, we didn't think this is going to last. This couldn't have been the truth, the case for us. And but we got through the siege. They let us out, basically thinking, well, they'll take them in Bosnia. We went into Bosnia. They'll take them there and take them to a concentration camp. We don't want to deal with them right now. And when we got to Bosnia, the streets were empty. The roads were empty. They were of civilian cars. They were just trucks with soldiers, and all heading to Croatia, to our part of the country, to fight the war. So my parents just continued going with very little gas, and various miraculous things actually happened. I don't have time to go into all of them. But basically, we now had to go figure out where the safety is. And through various prayers and thinking, very quickly my parents decided they will try to go back to Croatia, through a different part of Croatia, and back to Zagreb, which is the capital, where we had some family, and that, from what we could tell, was safe. And so we drove through Bosnia, we got into eastern Croatia, and so this is the part of Croatia I've never been to. You know, like when you're a kid in school, you learn about your country, and I learned about this flat, beautiful land with farms and big oaks and horses, and it was so flat that the only place like you could really build a village was around the road. It was the only definition sort of in the land. And I just imagined this bustling life. But when we got there, this was also the front line. And I hadn't seen the front line like this yet because we just left before that happened in the town. The villages were empty, and the houses had bullet holes in them, and they were burning, and there was nobody around, no bustling farm life or singing or whatever I was expecting. And on the radio, we learned we were just driving through a lull in the bombings. And I actually now take our students, my husband and I take our students to this part. This is the area where the town of Vukovar is, where some of the greatest tragedies were happening as I was driving with my family through here. So almost 24 hours later, usually the distance between the town I grew up in and Zagreb is an hour and 15 minutes, but almost 24 hours later of driving, we made it to Zagreb, to my great aunt's apartment. There was so much symbolism along here, and I was 11, but I could see it. I was brought into this apartment when I was first born from a hospital. I was born in Zagreb, and now I was here again, at strange sort of beginning of a new epoch of my life. And then a few days later, we decided that we were going to go to the northern Croatian coast that also wasn't in the war at the time. And so we moved there, and the first realization I had to face was that now I was a refugee child. And what this meant came in small doses and large. At first, nobody would admit me to school. They didn't want refugees in their schools. That part of Croatia was worried about all the refugees overwhelming their beautiful Mediterranean peninsula. The neighbor pulled some strings. He was my great aunt had a house there on the coast where we stayed for a little while, and he pulled some strings and got me into school. But as soon as I was in school, there were announcements being made about me in class, including that I need books. Do people have older siblings who can give me books? And I just realized in that moment, I had my beautiful new books in my room. They were like folded in plastic, and why didn't I bring them? And why didn't I? I mean, we were thinking about survival, really, not about regular life. And the clash between these different priorities, the ones in the wartime and the ones in peacetime, started to become really difficult reality for me. My world had crumbled, but the rest of the world had barely changed. I remember wanting to say to everybody around me that I too had a home and I too had a regular life like they do. I'm actually sure I did. I was 11 many times, tried to explain to them just what I had left behind. But the truth is, and I think I slowly realized this, once you have to talk about it, it is no longer there. It's no longer real. And the difficulty of that was also that because of this, I started being looked at as somebody who doesn't, not only doesn't have it, but couldn't have it, couldn't be a part of the rest of society. And this was extremely painful, and I didn't yet know at that point how to deal with it, because I didn't know that pain is not something you run away from, but something you walk through, something you mourn so that you can heal. Instead, what became almost an obsession for me was wanting to have a normal life. And I think that I spent much of my time figuring out how to be and appear normal, have normal friends, be fun and cool. But as I will soon explain in more detail, that method was not good for me and my well-being. You might ask why. Well, simply because it wasn't the truth. Because I wasn't normal as much as I wanted to be, and because something big had happened to me. What I needed more than trying to fit in, although there's a certain amount of healthy trying to fit in, was to have a quiet space in myself, a pause in the mayhem of force, of violence, of power struggles that were surrounding me, to acknowledge what was happening to me and to mourn it. Now, I was a child. How could I have known it? And perhaps here is the tragedy of violence. It affects everyone, and even though a child, even though an innocent victim, I had to figure out what am I going to do with this, that happened to me. And I still have to, I still do. See, what I needed to do, what would have been healing and salvific, and eventually it was to learn and accept that life is difficult, that suffering is a part of being human, and that I need not be afraid to enter it. In fact, by entering it, I would have had a chance of finding joy. Years later, I realized something that was extremely important for me, and that is in many ways influencing what I'm sharing with you here today. God cannot work with our pretend realities, but He will meet us in the truth, in our actual reality, no matter what it might be. Taking on our suffering, our difficulty, truly and sincerely, we meet the God of truth, who will then turn our cross into His cross, and who will guide us through it all. The image that comes to mind when I was writing this is of walking behind Jesus to Golgotha. And it's the image that people have used over and over again in human history and Christian history. Why? I think one of the reasons is certainly because Jesus took on His suffering and turned it into life, and He did not turn to violence. Simone Weil, the Jewish French philosopher I already mentioned, tells us that the world will be ruled by force when we fail to recognize that the truth of our human condition is suffering. See, suffering is the truth of your life, but also of mine and everybody sitting right there next to you. No matter how cool, put together, organized, beautiful, or disheveled, disorganized, whatever you do to go through your day, suffering is important to your life, and making space for it will keep you healthy. Weil shows that we avoid suffering by employing force. I will interpret her work a bit simplified here to say that when we are faced with suffering, we often choose to fix it in two ways: by becoming a perpetrator of violence or by becoming a victim. Now, the victim side of things is a bit more complicated. I hinted at it by telling you my story. I wanted to avoid my suffering, that life with those who didn't understand me, my new friends, was just compounding, making bigger. And I didn't attack them violently. I knew I would have lost that battle, and also I was pretty sensitive already and deplored violence. Instead, what I did was to reduce myself. I stopped valuing my life and experience, which now included a war, and convinced myself to fit into this very small space that I was living for myself, in which I imagined what normal is. Simone Weil describes how victims that know that they will be killed lose signs of life even before they die. So there is something called the galvanic response. So when you are shot, your body jerks. You see this in the movies. And in fact, when we go to Srebrenica, we watch a movie where you see execution of some young men who don't have that response. They knew they were going to die, and they, in a sense, died before they did. It's very difficult to watch. That's an extreme example, but becoming a victim, as Miroslav Volf also reminds us, implicates you into violence, and you must be vigilant about it. You didn't choose this, but here it is. It is your predicament, and you must face it. And yet, in healing victims, God faces what took place. He faces what happened, and He transforms that. It is really good to remember that He does not ignore reality. Now, on the other side of victims, we have violators, perpetrators of violence. These people solve their suffering by force, usually by removing obstacles placed before them. They're so carried away with their way of solving problems that they begin to see other people as penetrable material. These are words from Simone Weil, penetrable material. They do not and cannot, when taken by the power of force, hear the human predicaments, plights, requests to let people live and to flourish. They run through them, or we should say, we all use these responses. We run through them, through each other. In war, this happens to bodies. You kill bodies. But it can also happen on many levels, emotional, spiritual, affecting someone's ability to provide for themselves, to have space to live in freely, etc. See, but perpetrator here might seem as a subject, as an actor, full person, who now reduces others to victims. But she or he, Weil tells us, is also objectified by force and power, which is after his or her soul also. First of all, when we engage in forceful behavior, we are convinced that the power is ours, given to us, and that we will do with it what we want, and that it will not run out. We feel powerful. They show us that this is not the case. The force will mislead you and tell you that you can do things that you have no authority to do. We have no authority to kill others or violate them in any way. They looks at Greeks and says they had a concept of destiny to teach them that eventually everybody comes to suffering. And she looks at the Iliad, which many of you might have read, to show how in the battles in Iliad you have this flip-flopping between victors and victims. And she says this is what the world ruled by force looks like. And the greatest tragedy, perhaps, of force is that it tells us that we are separate from one another, that you and I, that victors and victims have nothing in common, and are each to struggle and fight for themselves. The cure for this, tells us Vey, is to note our common suffering. In Bosnia, they do these peace groups. There are 3 sides that were battling in Bosnia, and they bring all 3 sides together, and the most successful peace groups, peace talks, or that focus, I guess they're called focus groups, are the ones where people share their experience with each other, and then at the end they realize, man, we were suffering the same thing, all of us, as we were fighting each other. But to note that, to note the suffering, the common suffering, we have to be able to take a pause from force. And force, as I've already hinted at, is antithetical to pausing and considering. It doesn't want us to do that. But only when we pause can we begin to see our plight and the plight of others. Now, there are people in the world in situations similar to the ones I've described that did manage to find a pause in the mayhem of force, and they stepped into a different reality. There are probably many we'll never know about that did some things that are so amazing we would speak about them in chapel, but there are those that we know about and that have infected people around them with this new reality. So I'm thinking here of Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Simone Weil, and many others. In Bosnia, on all sides, you also have these people. I'm thinking of one remarkable imam, Hafiz Bugari, who talked to our group about his conversion from an angry Muslim, because in Srebrenica, people that were killed were Muslims, to one that met God's love and understood something about our common humanity and now loves all of us, all people, Christians, Muslims, and we really felt that in his presence. There's an Orthodox priest, Danilo Pavlović, who's working to rebuild communities in Bosnia from the Serbian side, and the Serbs are seen as villains. But they've also been violated really badly in World War II, and he's trying to create a new narrative, the one that doesn't say we have to turn from victims to victors and so on. And then there's our new friend, Franciscan Ivo Marković, who gives so much hope to his Catholic community as well as the other communities around him. I know Ivo best, so I will just quickly say a little bit about him and what he taught us. The world, he once showed us a chart, works on the surface level through power and force, but God permeates the world, working in a very different, more innocuous and yet very powerful way. Here you can think of the mustard seed parable, and there are many others in the Bible like it. But the mustard seed is the tiniest seed. You can't see it. And then it grows almost imperceptibly into a huge tree that then shelters people. And I think Ivo and these peacemakers are really doing that for people who've been hurting in the war, providing a shelter, and you don't even know where they came from. His lesson to everyone is always that the way of God is present and strong, and he says, don't be afraid. Be courageous. God is always at work, but not in the way the world thinks. And if not careful, you might miss it. But if you choose it, you become a part of something remarkable, something that makes all things new. See, Ivo's family, while he was building peace in Bosnia, was killed at that time. His father was killed, and I think 13 or 14 of his relatives. Like Martin Luther King, he was threatened, his car was bombed, but he always managed to choose peace because he says he knows the truth of it. His father's death hit him the hardest, and he said he felt a momentary desire for revenge. But he knew that revenge was death, and life by force, which he refers to as spiral of violence, is a reduced life. He'd said simply, very simply in that moment, he wondered whether he should have been organizing arms rather than peace. But then he said, I knew better. Since I'm a Christian and I knew that violence is a never-ending spiral and it stems from fear, I knew I can't choose it. He rather chose the path of suffering, mourning his father's death, and he was continuing to work for peace. He also shows everybody around him, and this is remarkable joy he carries with him, that life taken in this path of choosing suffering is a joyous life and much more powerful. Because when you're next to evil, you really aren't afraid. You're really convinced that there's something bigger at work here. But we don't need the war to enter and encounter suffering and be able to be transformed by embracing it. There's certain other sufferings, smaller but significant, that frankly lead to these great tragedies or can prevent them. So, first, let's talk about the suffering that comes through doubt about who you are, whether you are loved, whether we are all worthwhile, whether anybody and ultimately God cares for you, whether you will be okay. This is a basic human concern, so basic that in the Bible it comes as the first concern human race faces. After beautiful, glorious creation comes to be in Genesis 3, the snake asks Eve if she is sure that God is telling her the truth, that he really loves her, and that he is not just trying to trick her and dominate her. See, even in the setting as glorious and beautiful as we have in Genesis, we still had to answer this primal question. Am I worthwhile? Am I loved? Does anybody care? But instead of facing the question, we hide it. We are ashamed of it. We cover over it. This is the primal human response, and this is what Adam and Eve did. See, Eve very quickly acts, if you read Genesis, against this thought. She eats the apple in order to chase away the terrible thought of her insufficiency, of not being worthwhile, of not being loved. She takes and wields force over her state of being. Adam, by the way, has no other thought either. If there's possibility of this, he thinks even less about it. He doesn't even talk to the snake about it. He just eats the apple, fixes it. And what follows is the world order of force. Mayhem, confusion, reduction of eternal humans to now finite humans who look at themselves as naked, as weak. They have lack of access to resources, their separation from God, and then very soon we can enable the separation from one another. You probably all know the story of Cain, but I hope you read it again more carefully after today. The sons of Adam and Eve bring their offerings to God, and God regards Abel's and not Cain's offering. We don't know why from the text. The text doesn't tell us, and it seems to think it is not important. What is important is how Cain reacts to that question that arises. What is wrong with me? Does anyone care for me, love me? And again, we see how Cain avoids this question by killing his brother. He is supposed to fixate it on getting rid of this question and doubt. Cain was concerned that God didn't care for him, or some version of that. But the thing is, if you read the text, that God came to him right after this incident where his gift wasn't regarded and tells him to slow down, be careful. Look at what's happening to you. We see that God does care for Cain. Even when Cain commits the murder, God prevents anybody from killing him, although Cain is set on this to and fro going around the earth, this life of force. Let me jump ahead a little bit to the Gospel of Luke, Luke 19. Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus stands above Jerusalem a couple of times and implores people in Jerusalem, like God did in Cain's story, to pause and care for things that make for peace. Truth is certainly one of those things that make for peace. The truth that Cain's sacrifice wasn't regarded. The truth that is painful. The truth that someone didn't love you the way you loved them. The truth that you might not be as talented as the person next to you. That you failed to do something as well as you wish you did. That you're not as beautiful. But see, the parallel thought to this regarding things that, caring for things that make for peace, and truth being a part of that, in the way the Gospel of Luke is structured, again, when Jesus looks at Jerusalem, is that he wanted to gather us under his wings, like the hen gathers its brood. When we face the truth, and this is what I've learned, what you find is that he will meet you there, gather you under his wings. But he will gather you as you are, and then he will begin to transform you if you let him. Now, as I was writing this, I talked to my students, and there are a bunch of them here that can witness to this, in my office about these things. And I'm always concerned when my students leave, and a few days I see them say, "How are you doing?" They say, "I'm doing great. I figured it out." They don't say I figured it out, but I can kind of see that they think they had a hard day, they faced it, and now they feel better. That's not the kind of suffering I'm talking about. That's a good step. But I don't want you to go out there and think, God will descend now if you face your trouble, and it will all be done. No, it's a process. It's a process of transformation. I'm talking about real suffering. It's the suffering that I'm terrified to think about, even though I grow in confidence all the time that going through it is the only way. Remember Jesus in the Gethsemane garden? That's the kind of suffering we're talking about. Sometimes it's quick. There are little things we can look at, like I behaved foolishly with a friend because I was embarrassed about something. But there are bigger ones, and you all know what they are in your lives. And yet, this difficult suffering, as we've seen with Jesus, is the redempting suffering. The suffering I'm talking about here and facing it is the kind that will transform you. You will become full of joy, like our friend Ivo. You will feel the resurrection in your body here and now that is just a taste of things to come. You will feel and know what it means that he turned my mourning into dancing. And I will leave you here with this thought from Martin Luther King that he wrote when he was asked to write more about suffering, because he was writing about civil action and suffering sort of theoretically, but he asked him to write from his personal experience. So here's what he said. This is pieces from this text, so I cut it out. Due to my involvement in the struggle for the freedom of my people, I have known very few quiet days in the last few years. I have been arrested 5 times and put in Alabama jails. My home has been bombed twice. A day seldom passes that my family and I are not recipients of threats of death. I have been the victim of a near-fatal stabbing. So in a real sense, I have been battered by the storms of persecution. I must admit that at times I have felt that I could no longer bear such a heavy burden and have been tempted to retreat to a more quiet and serene life. But every time such a temptation appeared, something came to strengthen and sustain my determination. I have learned now that the Master's burden is light precisely when we take his yoke upon us. Recognizing the necessity for suffering, I have tried to make of it a virtue. If only to save myself from bitterness, I have attempted to see my personal ordeals as an opportunity to transform myself and heal the people involved in the tragic situation which now obtains. I have lived the last few years with the conviction that unearned suffering is redemptive. The suffering and agonizing moments through which I have passed over the last few years have also drawn me closer to God. More than ever before, I am convinced of the reality of a personal God. So I leave you with these thoughts. And I want you to know that Gordon programs, we have 2 specifically Gordon programs, our own, and Matt Dole is the director of Orvieto program in Italy. We really take care to work with you to provide, like I said at the beginning, experience that will allow you to think these big questions as well. We care about your specific interests. You can do some studio art with famous artists in Orvieto. You can come to us and do internships with interesting political NGOs, work with refugees, and so on. But again, we hope to educate you in the manner of liberal arts, all of you, whole person. Of course, it's always up to you to take advantage of that, and it's your decision. And so along these lines, just to repeat what Laura Carmer said, go check out the Geo Fair, see what all opportunities you have to go out there and try on something new around the world. Thank you.